So where I would like to begin is you start with the idea of how the separate spheres of public and private came to develop. And you give us in your opening chapters a detailed summary of how that happened, moving from ancient Rome and ancient Greece through medieval Europe and then into the Victorian age. And you talk about the contrast between ancient Greece, in which there was a clear division between public and private, and it was a sexed division. Women were in the home, in the private sphere. Men were out in the public sphere, which was considered the realm of importance, meaning, action, the political sphere. And you quote Aristotle about man being a political animal. And then that kind of division between public and private dissolved in the medieval period. Do you want to start by talking us through that history a bit?
Yeah, so I look at public and private as a lens through which to understand all sorts of developments in human and history. So there's always some kind of division. It might just be around toileting or sex. There's this kind of separation from what other people can see and where authority can go. But in Athens, you had this very strict division, really, between the domestic sphere and the public sphere. And as you say, the public sphere was this realm of achievement, of great works and great men. They would go to war, they would commit fantastic speech acts. And in fact, all the buildings that we have from that period are either the Acropolis on the hill. Nothing from the kind of domestic sphere really remains in the same way. It was sexed, as you say. Well, slaves and women were in the private realm, and they were there really to service the men, to allow them then to be these wonderful citizens. The private realm was meaningful. It was a religious place as well, but it wasn't considered the achievement of humankind. That would dissolve, that clear separation. In the medieval period, there was very little separation between authority and the common person. You're all mixed together, both kind of physically, but also I try and look at it also conceptually, whether there's this sort of distinction that people are making between how far authority can go in their lives, what runs their lives, whether they have a space away from authority, as well as the community. And the community would have policed and organized the lives of their neighbors, and there would have been very little distinction between public and private. And in fact, it's really, you see people writing about privacy really up until the sort of 17th century, and they're talking about it as a dangerous place. Being in private was seen as dangerous. The devil might come to you when you were on your own. It was a place really for murderers and adulterers, in the lines of one preacher. So I try and look at how that division begins, and it's accidental. I don't think people are kind of looking for it, and I don't think it's tied as much to prosperity and property as I had assumed. This sort of natural growth of a private sphere coming with prosperity. It's much more political than that.
So you talk about people in the Middle Ages where they were in company, in public for many, many parts of their lives that we'd now consider private. People were born in public. Your family, friends, priest, gossip women were around you as you were giving birth. And when you were dying, you would send for the priest, and the church bells would toll to announce that you were lying in bed there dying, and people would come to see you while you were dying. And there were even, this is in a slightly later period in the book, but there was even a case that you describe in which a couple were prosecuted by the ecclesiastical courts for fornication, i.e. adultery, extramarital sex. And that was because the testimony of a neighbor who spied them through a crack in her wall, which looked onto their bedchamber. And even royalty would have, that they had their servants who were attending to their every need, and it was quite normal to be attended whilst you were dressing, perhaps even when you were on your chamber pot, etc.
Yes.
And that is
I know it sort of frightens the life out of us, doesn't it, us with our huge bathrooms and doors and locks and keys. Yes, that's right. I mean, if we take royalty, for example, or a feudal lord, their private position, as in who they were born to, being born into royalty or a position of authority, was very much based on their private position. And so their authority was based around themselves. So if you go to like France at Versailles, there's a huge kind of dressing of the king and queen in the morning, which, depending on how senior you were in the royal household, you would get greater access to their private selves. And so this was a demonstration of authority. In terms of things like the bum courts, this is in the 17th century in England, and they were called, they were colloquially known as the bum courts or the bawdy courts. As you say, fornication, sex outside marriage, this was illegal, and the community policed its own. So you were compelled to police your neighbours, otherwise you too could be arrested if they were doing something that you knew to be wrong and you overlooked it, turned a blind eye. You too could be prosecuted for basically encouraging it. And it was entirely normal, and it was mandated really to spy on your neighbours and to check that they were not doing anything wrong. Now obviously people did, because we are human, and people probably did overlook it. But you can see in terms of prosecutions and also pregnancy that there is a great variation between the 17th century and the 18th century when these laws do change. That people are obviously later on having more sex, even allowing for kind of things that happen behind closed doors. But the bum courts, it was a very shameful thing. So the penance for the couple, Joan Amphlett, the couple you mentioned, we don't know the exact details of what happened to them, but it would be common for people to parade in the marketplace once they've been tried. At the trial, as you say, that the neighbours would give testimony, which would say, I saw through a crack in the door, I saw through the crack in the window, and all the rest of it. Entirely accepted evidence.
Well, they didn't have TV in those days,
Exactly.
so you had to have something to watch.
And you could probably hear as well. I mean, you know what old houses are like.
Mm.
So there was no sense in which privacy was a norm there, that you'd respect somebody's privacy. It was the opposite. You wouldn't respect, it would be right and proper not to respect somebody's privacy. In fact, if they went into to look like they were going into somewhere private, that would be seen as suspicious. But the public shaming was a very serious thing. So they would walk around the marketplace in a white sheet, or you'd throw vegetables at them for doing wrong. And there's many accounts of people saying, please, can I pay, rather than be publicly shamed as penance, because the public shaming was like that kind of, the scarlet letter that you have later in those novels. And people lived in a very tight-knit community. They regulated that through, everybody had the sort of same rhythm of life. Everybody had to go to church at the same time and worship also at home in the same way. And so anybody sort of standing outside that was seen as I suppose, it's not just suspicious, but dangerous, because you'd be disrupting the pattern of life in the community.
So you talk about in the book the beginnings of a notion of a right to privacy, where in a sense it was a side effect of religious freedoms. And I'm just going to quote something you say here, which is, so you talk about the way in which, with the English Civil War, the idea of practicing your religion in private, that began to be seen as a right. And you have Elizabeth I, of course, saying, I do not seek to make windows into men's souls. I'm not going to inquire into people's private religious convictions. And I'm just trying to find the exact quotation that you talk about where you precisely say it. I can't find it now, but you talk about the way in which this right to privacy was very closely connected with the right to freedom of conscience in religion. So if you could, here we are, once the arguments for freedom of conscience were loose in the world, they proved uncontainable. The acceptance of toleration and private conscience over the most important question of all, how to achieve eternal salvation, led to the acceptance of other kinds of belief and behavior. In essence, notions of religious freedom had a liberating effect on other ideas of freedom. The realm of conscience was extended. So would you like to talk us through that a bit?
Yes. So I do begin the book with Luther and Thomas More, with kind of two very different, one that would effectively create the Protestant Reformation, the other that would create kind of dissident Catholicism. So very different beliefs and different ideas also of conscience. But debates over conscience are very live in this period, over these kind of hundreds of years. And this is a time when private faith is publicly mandated. So you have to follow faith in a particular way. Go to church, pray. The kind of route to God, to salvation, is determined publicly. By kind of challenging that, both More and Luther, in their own ways, crack open that that a relationship between public and private. They make a distinction between what one says and what one thinks, as do the many other heretics and people who then privately follow their own route to God during that period. Many are, as More is, he is executed for it, for wanting to follow the Pope and the Universal Church rather than anarchy, which is how he describes Luther. But you have people writing this period about having to, say, under Henry VIII, take an oath which recognizes Anne Boleyn and her children as the rightful royal, and also a demotion of the Pope, because Henry makes himself supreme leader of the church. You have people writing this period basically saying, in a period when you were meant to say things publicly that you felt privately, you weren't, that dissimulation was seen as a negative thing. You have people writing this period that I said sort of to God, saying I said one thing publicly that I didn't believe privately. And my heart and in my mind is true, even though I'm not saying something publicly that goes along with that. People like Thomas Hobbes is writing in this period about the limits to authority, really, the Leviathan. Even though he's seen very as a conservative thinker now, it was quite revolutionary. He talked about thought being free. So in your head, you can think whatever seditious thoughts you want. After a great deal of bloodshed, as well as all this writing, you do get this recognition of toleration, which is that it's a way of dealing with religious diversity, which is that it is confined effectively to a private sphere. It's not seen as a positive thing. It's seen as a sort of limiting of authority. There's all these debates over conscience in this period, which then were originally around faith. John Locke talks about this. John Locke talks about the basis for conscience in faith, but he says it is only for faith. He says it's not for anything else. You can follow your own conscience in faith, but nothing else. This is sort of the end of the 1700s. But come the 1800s, when you have this tremendous split, really, what I call the age of separations between public life and private life. And that saw the coffee houses and the newspapers and the embryonic political parties that explode in this period. There's also a lot of debate around conscience in relationship to intimate life. And so those bum courts, the bum courts are abolished, and you have men about town and women about town. Boswell, for example, or Anne Lister, a lesbian diarist, writing about desire and lust and infidelity, really, with enthusiasm. And they do it in the language of conscience. Something that nobody wanted to happen happens, and suddenly there is this period of toleration in terms of intimate matters. People who previously, I think women would turn up to the altar in very few cases pregnant earlier on in the time of the bum courts, but come the 18th century, it's like a quarter, 40% so more are turning up to the altar pregnant. So there is obviously a difference in sexual behavior.
There's also a newfound valorization of the private sphere, which I noticed, for example, when I was looking at in St. Bartholomew's Church. If you look at the tombstones on the wall there, you can see the tombstones of people who died during the Renaissance. The descriptions of them, these are all descriptions of men. The descriptions of the men will say, the person was a courtier and a soldier, etc. And it might say that he's survived by, that's not the language they use, but might say he's survived by wife and children. But front and center are the public achievements, the public role. And it's when you get to the 18th century that suddenly it says he was a loving husband and father, which is a kind of tradition we've sort of retained today. I mean, I think LinkedIn is the last bastion of the Renaissance view. But if you notice, someone like, taking a completely random example here, but William Shatner, Captain Kirk of Star Trek. So his Twitter bio says, father to 3 daughters are the first words of his Twitter bio. And then it says Canadian actor. That kind of reversal, that what's important is the privates, that seems to shift in the 18th century. It's also partly a kind of, also as in the Greek period, it goes along with a strongly sort of sex-based separation. And that comes with a shift from the household being the location of production to men going out to work. So women are at home looking after children and looking after the house, keeping things going. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
I mean, I think so. The 18th century, I think, is such an exciting period because you do get this separation between public and private. The kind of the areas of public life, not just coffee houses, but theatre and opera and pleasure gardens. And this applies to men as well as women, although women, as you say, are much more confined to the home, but I think at the same time the home is given valoration and kind of it's freed up to be an area of intimacy and a sanctuary, because you aren't just doing everything in the home to sell at the marketplace and people coming and going of all kinds. It's kind of freed up, and I think that is a kind of progressive moment for both men and women, although it does become confining because women don't have the kind of equal access to the public realm, which they do quite early on begin to kind of complain about in certain limited fashions. The valuing is what's really important. And I think both are valued, both the public realm and the private realm. So how are they valued? They're valued in kind of literature, and certainly the private realm, whether it's Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which, although is about a man on an island, it is about both sociability, what man is like with people, which is seen as very positive. There's all sorts of clubs and these kind of places where you go and associate with people, whether it's balls or assembly rooms. And it was quite a radical thing at the time because this is a mercantile society. So there is a rising bourgeoisie who previously wouldn't have been part of society, but they're coming into it, and they'll go to the dances and meet each other. And sociability is seen as a very good thing. There's a French for politeness, to polish, kind of is something that people start talking about now. And if you think about what it would have been like, so you're meeting people you don't necessarily know the status of. There's travelers and merchants coming to sell things from all over the world. And after the civil wars, people are thinking about how to act in public. And in fact, the idea of the public as a kind of authorizing force comes into play. People start talking about public opinion in relation to theatre criticism. So the bourgeois public becomes seen as a very positive thing. But at the same time, too, something quite similar is happening in the private realm. The corridor is invented, back stairs are kind of put into place. This is a gradual thing, but it certainly creates private spaces in the home. The servants move from the foot of their master's bed to their own attic quarters. They're still kind of summoned by a bell, but they're kind of the sense of separations in the private realm begins to harden, if you like. And then there is the novel, as well as the Crusoe. There's the Samuel Richardson's Pamela, Tristram Shandy. These novels talk about the passions, and they write about kind of the heart and the head in a way that hadn't previously been on the page, both because it was theatre, and so you might have had a soliloquy, but there wasn't this kind of description on the page in writing that people could read, and they read it in their thousands. It's a tremendously successful form. and it does value the private. And by the end of the sort of 18th century, people are writing their own private diaries, which are not seen as, I mean, they just didn't exist beforehand in the same way. So Puritans might have kept a prayer diary about their praying, but this is, by the 18th century, people are writing about their ordinary lives, and the ordinary becomes valued. I mean, a way that the Greeks would have been horrified about. You know, just like, why would you be? This is not important.
Although it's also something that's feared. So women's reading in particular, the reading of novels. On the one hand, there's a voyeuristic fetishization of people's private feelings, which we see with a massive craze for Richardson's Pamela, which he wrote, for those who don't know, as a 56-year-old man. He wrote his first novel in the first person as the private, basically diaries and letters of a 15-year-old serving girl who's being sexually harassed by her boss, or quote unquote sexually harassed. I mean, their opinions differ on this because she does end up marrying him, which is a good result for her. So possibly she's carefully stringing him along, making sure she doesn't lose her virginity so that she's got something to bait him with.
That's a Henry Fielding point of view, the Shamala. She's a manipulative social climber.
Yeah, which I think is a positive.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of fear of women in private, and especially servants and other low-class types, reading novels and having these intense personal experiences, getting ideas above their station, and also, which you can see in Pamela, you know, thinking you might be able to marry your boss, and also just, you know, there are lots of paintings of women on couches looking kind of post-orgasmic, with a novel falling out of their hands.
I
So
think
it's both celebrated and it's a source of social anxiety.
Yes, very much so. I mean, privacy is, there's always a strain that sees privacy as something dangerous because, as Hobbes said, thought is free. What are they thinking? If they are kind of having this direct relationship with print and no intermediaries, what are they thinking? And effectively, that's what kind of Luther sets off, is that you might have your own independent thought, and particularly around women who are seen as, you know, naturally less rational, more in tune with the emotions, and also as the person in charge of the home. So as it becomes more valued, I mean, there's this sort of balancing act between public and private. So with the Greeks, the public was more important. 18th century, public and private sort of reach a kind of equilibrium. Both are valued. And then by the end of the century, I think the private becomes a little bit more important. You can see this in the work of Rousseau and his kind of writings on the private self. And actually, there's an element of it in Pamela, where it's only when her kind of master reads her private letters and her true self that he falls in love with her and then becomes a reformed character. So there's this sort of valuing of the private self as the most important thing that begins then. And then so that kind of really kind of develops a lot more in the Victorian period, where the private realm is seen as so significant. But women do have a peculiar role in as much as they are then, it's peculiar in that yes, they are confined to the private. Yes, they are seen as more irrational and as if they shouldn't be too close to books in case something bad happens. But it's also a reflection that they're in charge of the household. I mean, maybe not formally, but effectively they run the household and they're responsible for the next generation. And so the private realm takes on this incredible importance that you have to socialize and educate your children to grow on to go up to be great, in terms of men, great patriots, and in terms of women, great mothers.
So you talk about, I'd like to talk about the Victorians a bit, but maybe we could approach it this way, which is that in the book you have a number of chapters in which you talk about specific technologies that resulted from, or that caused new debates in the kind of public-private dichotomy. And two I'd like to look at. One is the gummed envelope and how that came to be.
Yeah.
And the other is the Kodak camera.
Yes.
And you have lovely stories that are illustrating the importance of each of those. Do you want to begin with by talking a bit about Giuseppe Mazzini
Yes.
and the letters, the scandal of the opening of his letters?
So this is London, sort of 1844. Mazzini is an Italian nationalist. He wants to see Italy united and free of the Austrians, for example. And he's seeking political exile in London. He becomes quite fettered. He's a kind of a big noise for people like Charles Dickens and Thomas Carlyle, who are also very much part of sort of intellectual culture of the time. He's still kind of sending his revolutionary friends across Europe letters, and the Austrian prime minister asks the Brits to the Home Secretary, who is a Tory, to open his letters, which they do. And he becomes aware of this because there were no gummed envelopes in that time. There were just wax seals. And there's something this is a period of tremendous growth in letter writing, the penny post, which really democratizes letter writing. So you can just send a letter anywhere for a penny. And
extraordinarily fast. You could send letters, receive replies several times in the same day, which is extraordinary.
Extraordinary. All over the country, the mail coach is kind of thundering to bring people letters, and all sorts of letter writing becomes a kind of a really important ritual, but it's also a type of virtual privacy, isn't it? You're sending each other. It might be families disrupted by urbanization, or it might be your revolutionary friends, the Chartists, the kind of people involved in revolutionary activity. He finds out because he can see there's something slightly wrong with his envelope, and it becomes a national scandal pretty quickly because he is so well connected. Becomes a national scandal in the beginning newspaper of record of the day, the Times, but also in Parliament, because petitions are written on his behalf. And the Tory Home Secretary thinks there's nothing to this, right? He sort of stands up in Parliament and says, well, we can open people's letters. We've always done it. Like, there's nothing going on here, nothing to see. But Victorian society thinks the absolute opposite, and that is people like Thomas Carlyle, the Times, who very much are absolutely outraged, and they talk about it in terms of opening a man's letters as if it was a sacred violation, a violation of the sacred. It's his property. These are, they're liberals. It's property, but also it's his private self and his private business. And they do use the term sacred. Thomas Carlyle uses the term sacred, and it reflects. It's such a big scandal. You can see it reflects the way in which Victorian society sees the private as the most important sphere of humankind, the most important, more so than public life, and that it should be respected as if it was like an Englishman's home is his castle. It should be seen as utterly inviolable. The debate actually spreads about this particular case to Australia, to America, and it reflects a huge value that the Victorians had of the private realm. It was seen almost reverentially. If you read the sort of work of Ruskin, he talks about it as a kind of as a sacred place as well. And the Tory Home Secretary was just out of step with the time. Privacy takes on this kind of. It's no longer a place just for murderers and adulterers. It's no longer something to be feared. It's valued. And it's an organizing principle of society.
At least for respectable people, because the other thing you discuss in the book is that the Victorian age is the great age of do-goodery, and that there's a balance between respecting people's freedoms and trying to help them, quote unquote. Sometimes, very often, people you're trying to help don't want to be helped. And helping usually involves some kind of surveillance and supervision. And you draw some really interesting parallels with the present. And you talk about, so you have the Victorian social reformers nosing around in the slums, trying to stop people from drinking too much, having too much sex, being layabouts, etc. And where we are most ambivalent about this kind of interference, as it were, this violation of privacy is when it comes to children. So on the one hand, there's respecting the privacy of parents, their right to bring up their children as they want. And on the other hand, there's protecting the rights of the child. And that has been a balance that many societies and many times in history have failed to properly strike. And I'm going to bring it right up to the present for a second, but you talk about the Named Person Act in Scotland, which I found astonishing.
Yeah.
Even though you might be able to tell that I was originally Scottish, but I haven't lived there for many, many years. So tell us about that.
Yes. So, the Victorians, the intervention would have been in the Victorian period, stop children from working, because they were sent to the factories. They were treated as adults. It might be to educate them. And to a degree, yes, to intervene into people's lives because they were messy, unruly, and immoral. Women in particular at the forefront of all of this. Fast forward to the named person. What are the differences? So the named person is introduced in Scotland, which mandates that every child shall have a named person to oversee their well-being. So this isn't about stopping them going to factories or being even abused, of which there are some really tragic cases in the run-up to the named person of children that are killed at the hands of their parents. But the named person, although it's discussed in terms of these horrible cases, is this very kind of therapeutic term, which is well-being. So the well-being of a child is something that the named person is meant to oversee, which begins to very quickly worry parents who might be homeschooling their kids or might be religious or might just not be what your average mum and dad. They begin to think, well, maybe they're being targeted here. So they start to voice some concerns because the named person has they're kind of their legal parameters of this are as many things today. They're pretty unclear. And the terms are quite subjective. So this isn't about beating your child. This is about whether you're in one of the examples is about the decoration of a bedroom in the policy documents. Is their bedroom decorated properly? Where you think, well, really? Is this the responsibility of somebody that's not the mum and dad? Or the caregiver? So people begin to see this as incredibly intrusive and a violation of the home. And if the policy documents around it very rarely mention family, they mention carer, so these sort of slightly bureaucratic policy type languages for very intimate life. And social workers too become concerned because social workers are responsible for egregious harm in the home. And there's always this sort of delicate balance about at what point do you intervene. And it's not clear cut, but they become concerned that for all the concern about a child's wallpaper and their well-being, that distracts attention from very serious abuse and so this sort of putting eyes everywhere means they're not on the right cases, and there is a reaction to it. And it is repelled finally in Scotland, but it's instructive as to why. So as part of the named person, they had to collect data, and they took it, the opponents of the named person took it to the Supreme Court after a number of smaller court trials and won on the basis of a right to privacy, but around the collection of data not being safe effectively. So it was a successful attempt, but it was very much on the basis of the collection of data, not upon the violation of the home and not upon the violation of the role of the parent, really, which is what this actually is. It's basically a displacement of the parent by some kind of state figure who becomes more important, a challenge to the parents. What it represented was a much more kind of therapeutic notion of state intervention, not for specific wrongs, which is what we begin to see in the Victorian period, but a therapeutic idea of well-being, which is very subjective and puts the state everywhere for unclear purposes. We don't see it as a challenge against that. We see it very much on the basis of data. And I think that's one of the problems with discussions around privacy today, which is that it's all about the internet and data and cookies, and it's quite technical and boring, but it doesn't see the broader relationship or challenge the broader relationship between basically authority and the individual.
Yeah, you quote a lovely thing that J.S. Mill wrote, which is, I'm going to read, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant to interfere with someone's liberty. Interventions are only justified when an individual's actions cause harm to others, which Mill defined narrowly. So that is that I think that is a very good principle.
Yes, I love Mill. I love Mill and Harriet, his later wife. I mean, these debates are happening in the 19th century very much in terms of how far can the state, not just the state actually, how far can the state go into the private realm, into restricting an individual's freedom. They're also talking about custom, because they sort of argue that the power of custom is as kind of restrictive as state authority. But they see a kind of moral case for the private realm, which I think we've sort of abandoned. So it requires seeing people as agents of their own life, really. And it requires appreciating that people may behave in private in ways that you don't approve. They may have 3 wives, or they may teach their children about creationism, or they talk about slightly different examples. But it requires having a sense of, in their eyes, people being able to make their own mistakes. And they sort of argue that unless we understand people as moral agents, then effectively we treat them almost as children, as if they need kind of their hands being held the whole time. And I like that idea of, it is this sort of, giving people this free, sort of a private life, or sort of, closing the door, does require this sense in which people can make their own mistakes and don't need their hands being held the whole time. And I think that's what the named person didn't really have, which is this sense of, well, so long as you're not really hurting each other, you need a little bit of, people need to be free in private to discriminate and make their own decisions, really. Otherwise, they're not adults.
Yeah. And hurting each other, I would add, has to be quite narrowly defined as Mill defined it. It can't be just, this might hurt their feelings or make them feel a little bit upset. I want to talk a little bit about the personal is political thing. So one of the things that you emphasize in the book, and throughout the book, you make an argument about the fact that you feel that the division between private and public has dissolved to everyone's detriment. And part of the kind of beginnings of that is in what you describe as both the left and the right politicizing the personal. And that really begins with the radical feminist movement. Carol Hanisch, I think, who was the first to say the personal is political. And do you want to talk us through that, how this idea of the politicization of the personal came to be and how that's been co-opted by both left and right?
I mean, I think you can see it in the Students for Democratic Society quite early on, and even in their kind of their manifesto, where they talk about the time has come for the reassertion of the personal. And I think the left in this period are turning away from the failures, the failures of alternatives to capitalism, the failures of those sort of social movements, the failures as they would see it as of the working class, not going along with everything they say, not behaving, and sort of turn away from, if you like, kind of material and social progress to the personal and developing the self.
A lot of this has to do with the failures of the Soviet Union and Stalinism.
Yeah.
So that becomes the kind of the big public projects. They've lost faith in the big public projects. So the emphasis turns to the more individual.
Yeah, it turns to the private self and the personal. And very quickly it becomes much more about behavior, and kind of, it basically takes the political into the private, takes the political into the personal realm. And the radical feminists take this further with that wonderful quote, of the Hanisch essay, "The personal is political." I think they have some insights, which is that, a lot of private problems that women had were seen as private, say abortion seen as an issue that they had to resolve privately, and it was illegal, and they had, it wasn't seen as a public matter. It's very hard for us to think about it now because all these private issues are now in public all the time. They kind of saturate the public discourse. Private feelings certainly do as well. So I think there was a sort of insight there, but they took it to mean effectively the dissolution of public and private. And also, I think you see in people like Kate Millett, they begin to argue that what happens in terms of the socialization of children, the organization of how men and women live, these are more important for social progress than public matters. Biology is basically the source of the patriarchy, as Firestone would have it. And that opens up the private. And it opens it up very quickly to them. Kate Millett, who is in who's probably bisexual, had a relationship with women, then marries a man. I mean, her private life becomes the focus of political discussion and intervention, effectively, because effectively, once you say the person is political, it means that anybody can criticize your own private life. Now, that does two things. A, it's really horrible and invasive because the private is often unruly, irrational. I mean, who we fall in love with and who we don't, it's not subject to political scrutiny. It's not subject to that kind of balance sheet of right and wrong. But it also dissolves the public. And what you see, particularly with the left from that period, is their eyes fall away from public projects, from social progress in terms of real material changes, from things that are in the public realm, and it just goes to the private. It's a very, very unfortunate development that I think we're still very much living with today, and certainly in our political life. It's very personal. It's very difficult it's very difficult to separate the personal from the political. And the right, particularly around issues of what become later cultural issues around abortion, for example, to overstep the border between public and private. So, for example, on abortion, wasn't so much it was accepted, particularly by religious figures in the States in the early 70s and late 70s, as a private matter. And there were not, Reagan was enthusiastic about making it legal. Enthusiastic's probably the wrong word, but it was seen as a sort of a matter for the woman and not to be discussed in public life. And that changes really with Phyllis Schlafly and a particular type of conservative feminism, and then later the Republican Party, who see it.
But doesn't Phyllis actually use the slogan, "The personal is political"? She adopts that as well, yeah.
She's brilliant and uses the language of the moment to basically push these private issues into the public realm and to basically open it up. And if you think back to kind of toleration in the 17th century, it was a way, creating the private sphere was a way of dealing with diversity and difference. That people believe different things, they want to do slightly different things with how they follow God or their lives. We will respect that diversity and stop it from leading to bloodshed by creating a private realm where it isn't a matter of authority or public opinion. And that's what the kind of the breaching of public and private forgets in the sort of 70s and 80s. And it's driven by the left out of their own failure, and the right just follow it on through.
As always, so any mistake made by the left is an opportunity to be seized upon by the right.
Absolutely.
I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said that. Because in the States in particular, this obsession with the private character of elected officials, and not their private character in the sense of their honesty in their public dealings, but their sex lives, basically.
Yeah, and you can see that with the criticism of Trump, who is, if you like, the most authentic politician. He really, in a way, that's why I think it's one reason why people think that they know what they're getting. So he speaks the language of authenticity that other politicians have tried to do on the left. Tony Blair being one. He could be trusted.
Oh my
God. But once we start talking about character, that becomes the parameter of political conversation is character. And as you
Mm.
say, it's not character in a sort of older sense of virtues. It is a kind of there is a kind of voyeuristic prurience. I don't want to know about his sex life. I want to know about his policies. But we really see that taking off with Bill Clinton, and the Monica Lewinsky affair, which is Republican driven as a way of getting Clinton. They're unable to do it through his policies or through what they initially attempt, which is sort of apparent financial irregularities, which they can never quite pin down. And they go for his private life, which he has problems in his private life. Like, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But you just think, what did that do? What did that do to that invasion of his?
It was a horrific violation of Monica Lewinsky's
Absolutely.
privacy.
Yeah. And it changed her
Yeah,
life for
absolutely
that's all she'll
terrible.
ever be now, is because of that. And she's managed to kind of get through it. But God, you read the Star Report, which was the report it's pornographic in the name
Yeah.
of transparency. But that effectively, I think you see the beginnings of a type of regulation of sex life by making it all public, that you can now see across campuses where everything has to be done in public, the consent kind of contracts that are made, and the introduction of the law into people's sex lives, which I think is actually deleterious.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's always a trade-off between respecting privacy and protecting vulnerable people. And that's certainly true. For example, as you point out, marital rape was legal for a long time because that was considered part of the private relations between men and women. And so I'm glad of that intrusion into privacy. And in the Me Too movement, there were some cases in which things that would previously have been just hushed up were made public, and that was a good thing. But there were also an enormous number of invasions of privacy. Aziz Ansari is the example that comes to mind. There was a long article about a date that he had with a woman, and we have only her word for what happened on the date. But even assuming everything that happened is true, it was a bit like distasteful, but it was also just purely private thing. So she objected to the fact that he wanted to put his fingers inside her mouth, and she said, that's disgusting. But whose business is it? Why is that anybody else's business?
Yeah, the Me Too is I hate the word complicated, but there's all sorts of things going on there, I think. I mean, one, I think you see from the 1970s onwards, a kind of a sense that intimate relationships are toxic. And at first you think, well, this is a kind of, they can be.
Penetration is rape.
Penetration is rape, yeah. And there's the cases of people going to the Tavistock Institute to therapy. This is before the Tavistock becomes associated with trans, so it's not that. But when they initially visit the Tavistock, people are asked the question: is there any reason in terms of your family life that you be having the trauma that you're having today? I.e., did your parents mess you up? And people initially just don't answer it because it's not in their conscious. It's just not. It's not a normal way of thinking that we're like this because mum and dad did something bad to us. And now, obviously, that's the opposite. It's our first, every kind of response is something happened to you that's bad. And I think that pendulum is a really, really unfortunate. And I think, you see people talking about relationships as toxic now. And I think there is a fear of intimacy. It does not surprise me that younger people are not having as much sex as they did 20, 30 years ago. I think there was that, and I think you saw that in Me Too. Small issues, and they're not non-existent issues, of treating each other poorly become magnified as if they are rape. You can see it talking to young men that they're frightened now to a degree. So I think there was an element of that of Me Too, which I think was worrying, because I also think those things, it's not that there's a certain, as a woman, you do have to be able to navigate some of these interactions and accept that It won't always go your way. And you have to be able to say, no, that's not cool. And you have to be able to do it in on at the time in the
Yes.
workplace, and not go straight to social media to do it. There has to be, and you also have to have your kind of, it's almost like those sort of intermediary friends and colleagues who would have your back and say, that's really uncool what you did, which is what we probably had to do when we
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
teenage girls dealing with lecherous boys. And I think that sort of intermediary way of coping with those problems is also missing. I think the other aspect of Me Too is that the public shaming isn't the same as going to court, where, I mean, I'm even struck by that in terms of the Harvey Weinstein case. It's like there's something about going to court and having these things, this is egregious, really awful situations, where they become a matter of public record that this was wrong what you did. And that kind of creates a type of accountability. And absolutely,
Yes.
and it's very difficult because it goes on behind closed doors. So how you make people accountable for things that is one person's word against another is hard. But with the Me Too stuff, you didn't really have that. And so it's very difficult to trust the judgment of the crowd compared to the judgment of the court. So we don't
The other,
really get the kind of
yeah.
public accountability at the same time.
The other thing that's happening, I think perhaps one of the things that is dissolving boundaries between public and private is definitely the rise of social media. And you trace that very beautifully in the book, starting with the invention of the Kodak camera. And you have a case study there of she's a cabaret dancer who attempts to sue people for taking photographs of her. I think she successfully wins this case because although she dances on stage in this fringed leotard and stockings, which was risque for the day, she wants to be able to separate that performance from her everyday life. She doesn't want her daughter to see her in that outfit, and she doesn't want random men on the street who have not paid to see the performance to be able to see it. She wants control of her own image, and she gets it. But the invention of the camera is the beginning of kind of the end of the idea that the private sphere is something geographically separate. So you say, and I think this is quite interesting, there's no notion of privacy mentioned in the US Constitution. They've cobbled together an idea of privacy through what's known as penumbra. So saying that certain elements in the Constitution imply a right to privacy if you extrapolate from them, but there's no mention of privacy, and the word privacy is never used. And that's because it's covered under things like you can't enter a person's dwelling place to do illegal searches and seizures. So protecting the inviolate nature of the physical private space is enough to preserve privacy. Whereas once you have cameras, and then even more so the internet, there's no longer that privacy is separate from a physical location.
That's right. And the Kodak camera is the game changer. Because anybody can have a Kodak camera.
Fiends.
Yeah, anybody can have you no longer go to a studio where you have everything kind of done in one place. Kodak fiends are the people with the Kodak cameras, and they're everywhere, and they're described as this kind of frightening way as transgressing the border between public. And Henry James writes about this. Kodak is an insult.
Sorry. Kodak advertise themselves as, with these cameras, you can take a person's likeness without their knowing.
Yeah.
That was part of the advertising. Sorry to interrupt.
No, exactly. It's thrilling. And there is, I think, certainly when the private attains such status, it is thrilling. I mean, you all know that feeling of seeing what somebody is doing if they don't know you're watching. It is like this kind of thrill. And they very much play on this. I mean, the point, I think the thing about technology is that it's not the key determinant. I mean, it raises the question about where is the line between what is acceptable looking and where should you avert your eyes. It raises the question, but it doesn't determine it as much as some might say. And I think that's certainly the case with the internet. So it's entirely possible, I think, that in a different cultural environment, had the internet been introduced, we would behave quite differently than we do now, which isn't to say it hasn't accelerated and made possible, particularly with your phone, which you can take anywhere and record people, for example, record people's conversations and then air them in public. Doesn't mean to say it doesn't facilitate that, but I don't think it causes that. So the 1970s and 1980s, I think you see the dissolving of the public and private, partly through the personal as political and this kind of cultivation of the idea of the authentic self. That's always there. It's present in the 18th century with Rousseau and Pamela, the authentic self. But it's seen much more important. The private and the public and the private self seems much more important, really from the 70s and into the 80s onwards. And then you get the introduction of the internet. But that comes after the tremendously successful program on TV, Big Brother, which is all about watching and surveilling the private. These are not people involved. Initially, they're often people involved in sort of public life, but it very quickly descends into the domestic. So I think
Descends is correct.
Descends is correct, yeah. But I think one thing I wanted to try and do was chart the development of the way in which public and private had become blurred before the internet comes along. That means that when the internet is introduced, that's very quickly how it is used. But I just think in other circumstances, it would be used very differently. And certainly any solution to the problems we face around the incursions into the private realm are not technological. They're cultural and political.
Yeah, we kind of did this to ourselves. And I may sound very hypocritical here because I have an enormous digital footprint and I write a very personal blog on my Substack. And I do keep some things private. So basically, I keep things private that involve other people. So generally, I don't write. If I write a very personal story, it's very much about myself because I at least have ownership over that story. But a friend once told me that I publish things on the internet for everybody to read that he would not even tell his own mother.
Well, we do keep quite a lot from our mothers, that has to be said.
That has to be said, yeah. Maybe he's got an especially close relationship with his mother. But we've also become very narcissistic and there are many things to blame. There's you allude very briefly to John Vasconcelos and the self-esteem movement. There's the kind of politics has become extremely performative that people express their politics largely by going online and stating their opinions about things. I'm a journalist, so at least it's kind of my job to state opinions sometimes, but I don't know what everybody else's excuse is. And being rewarded or judged or applauded, basically signaling allegiance. That is all it is in the vast majority of cases. And there's also kind of a real valorization of identity. There's the whole identity politics things which happen on right and left. All of this has led to a kind of schizophrenic desire both to be private and to expose oneself. And I see this on social media all the time, that people say things on Twitter and they seem to believe that those things are private.
Yeah.
They actually genuinely seem to think that to be alarmed when, for example, a boss or potential employer or someone who can affect their real life circumstances sees what they've said. And I don't agree that employers should be able to police your social media. But on the other hand, some people seem just blithely unaware that it's even visible. It feels like, to many people, it feels almost like a private diary. But yet it's tweeting. So it's the least private thing imaginable.
That is a really odd thing, isn't it? When you see somebody update their status, it might even be that they've got a cold, And then you see them the next day in person. You say, "Oh, how's your cold?" And they'll look at you as if you're like, "How do you know?" You think, "Because you put it online." But I think that there is that kind of tremendous, I think there's a genuine confusion that people have between what should be public information and what should be private. And I use an example in the case of the book, of the academics in the States who put their sex life online. And
Mm.
they're surprised when it becomes a big controversy. And I spoke to them about it. They're really nice, and they say they're not doing anything wrong. It's we love each other. Everyone's consenting. Like, there's no problem here. Why is it controversial, and why has everybody suddenly got an opinion on our
This
sex
was
life? This is
This was the dean of a
yeah,
university who you describe, who has a swinger lifestyle with his wife, and they videotape themselves having sex with other people. And he's got an OnlyFans, or maybe it's on Pornhub. I can't remember, but it's out there somewhere publicly, so you can watch the videos. And he got fired from his university on those grounds. Yeah,
very
sorry,
much
carry
so.
on.
Yeah, but it's interesting because when I spoke to them, they use the language of the Google tech boss Eric Schmidt. He said if you're doing something wrong, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. And they sort of say, well, we've got nothing to hide. We're not doing anything wrong, and therefore it should be fine to be in public. And in their minds, there wasn't this distinction between it's entirely fine to do things in private and not show anybody. Just because you're not showing everybody doesn't mean it's wrong. It means that this is a slightly different, that when you put things in public, they change. Their meaning changes because effectively you said anybody can come along and have a look at this. It kind of changes its character. And that people do this around illness as well. And I mean, it makes me think of Kate Middleton, who was pretty much forced into sharing her cancer diagnosis publicly because trying to hide it was seen as a dangerous and frightening, as a sort of as if it takes us back to that sort of phrase, if you're doing something wrong, you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. The sense in which that doing something in private is a dangerous and strange, suspicious sort of thing that you see in the 17th century. So I think people have internalized that sense that if you're doing something in private, it's wrong, and therefore you need to sort of put it in public. And I think there is also a desire for sort of recognition and affirmation that people aren't getting from friends, colleagues, institutions. That means that they need to put it out there in front of strangers. I think we're very confused about what should be public and what should be private.
I do think as a royal you can't win because on the one hand, you have Kate being rebuked for having been private about her illness, but on the other hand, you have Meghan and Harry doing what South Park called their total privacy world tour.
Exactly. With placards outside their houses saying, we want privacy. I mean, I think, yeah, it's hard not to feel sorry for them. But I think they're in this, they're failing to do what other celebrities have done, which is to monetize their private world and to perform their private world. And Meghan just doesn't quite have the knack that maybe Gwyneth Paltrow does. But it's unfortunate that
I
they're
don't know
both...
who I dislike more.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think... Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that what you have is people being known for not for their public achievements. So not for being an actress in Suits or whatever Meghan was, the actress in the TV program that she was in. Then people aren't known for their public acts, for being public people. They can only be known as for their private achievements, for being great mothers, good, Martha kind of Stewart type cooks. And what that does, it kind of demeans and degrades public life because we talk about, people's private sex habits rather than their plans for world transformation, around hunger or whatever it might be. So it degrades public life, but it also means that their private life becomes a commodity for everybody and then you end up judging it. And that's the private realm is for the role of judgment in the private realm is your intimates and your friends, not for strangers on the other side of the world.
Yeah, yeah. A friend of mine recently, she's a YouTuber, as irony of irony, so she's always talking into the camera. And she said that she described her morning routine like YouTubers often do. And she said that one thing is it's important not to go online either to email or to social media until at least an hour after getting up, preferably 2 hours. Do your exercise, have your breakfast, parent your child, or whatever else you have to do in your private life, and try to delay that moment of encountering the digital outside world. You can encounter the real life outside world, but encountering the digital crowd. And the way she put it, which I thought was really good, was she said, I have to protect that first hour. It's them or me. It's them or me. What an
Yeah.
amazing
Yeah.
little statement.
I think it's very true, because what you have, I mean, David Reisman writes about this in the sort of 1950s in America. A change in human character and in behavior from a kind of internally focused individual that is has their eye on their forefathers and their immediate intimates towards the externally one. He says it's sort of the gyroscope changes from inner to outer. That's a development that has really speeded up in the last 20 years, where people are just performing in front of strangers. They're not even their peers, they're strangers. And it's their first thought is how do strangers see me? And how do strangers, you're performing your intimate life to strangers. And as a result, what happens? Well, you don't develop your inner life. It is interesting that people are talking about the decline in reading and reading books. And I think that maybe there's something that's part of that. You're immediately outwardly focused rather than focused on what's happening in your mind and engagement with the book. You're immediately kind of sending out tweets or messages. So I think that there's a real problem, which is that you're not developing your own internal kind of space. I mean, Hannah Arendt, sort of the political theorist, wrote that if you don't have, and she was somebody who loved the public realm, who was kind of politics is everything. She was a kind of almost an Aristotelian about the public realm, but she does write of the private realm. If you don't have one, you become shallow. And I think we're becoming very, very shallow as individuals as a result.
It's also, yeah, sorry.
So I think the other thing is that you're not,
yeah, go ahead.
if you develop your relationships entirely through the prism of strangers, then you're not focused on those relationships. And you need that kind of private realm for intimacy, a space where you shut the door, close the curtains, even if it's just to eat porridge, in front of the television with each other, whatever. But you need it to be better public citizens as well. And to go out in public, not performing your private life, but developing your public self. There's a phrase here called "bring your true self to work."
Yes,
What
no,
a terrible
please don't.
idea. Yeah,
Please
don't do
don't.
that. Yeah. Develop your public self. Develop your
Yeah.
capabilities of whatever it might be, a teacher, a plumber, whatever. That's what we need to be sort of developing, a sort of public selves. Otherwise, the two realms become degraded and we become poor public citizens.
So there's a quotation quite early in your book. Apologies for interrupting earlier, but this just instantly sprang to mind. And you're talking about this is the Earl of Strafford, who was the right-hand man of Charles I. And at his trial, this was during the run-up to the English Civil War, he claimed that private conversation should not be admitted as evidence against a man in court. He says, so I'm quoting him, words spoken to friends in familiar discourse, spoken at one's table, spoken in one's chamber, spoken in one's sickbed, spoken perhaps to gain better reason, to gain oneself more clear light and judgment by reasoning. If these things shall be brought against a man as treason, this takes away the comfort of all human society, friend and neighbor. So it's interesting that because he identifies the fact that, of course, if you are speaking in public, especially if it's real-time media, like at a trial, or in a conversation or on social media, you are exposed to instant judgment. So you don't have time to do thought experiments, to kind of talk your way through things, to let your thoughts run loose, because immediately there are little toes all over the place waiting to be trodden upon. So you can't just walk freely. And he predicts that the kind of awareness of this will lead to a silent world, but it hasn't. It's led to, we're all trying to speak and grab attention and also instantly being judged.
Well, it hasn't, we're not utterly silent, but we're not able at the same time to speak freely. And it's led to a situation where it's entirely legitimate to record people in private and expose it as if they are hiding something, rather than the fact that they are different in private. So there isn't this acceptance that, in private we say stupid things. Sometimes they're what we think, sometimes they're what we're thinking, sometimes we're just letting off steam, particularly in this day and age where speech is so rigorously policed and people are, stepping on eggshells. I think it's what it's actually done is mean that we are inauthentic in public, really, or we act as punks, so deliberately transgressive. We're inauthentic in public.
Which is also inauthentic.
Which is also inauthentic. Yeah, very much so. And I think it also, any event that I do now, which is semi-public, but also even in sort of semi-private events, you can see people are worried about being recorded and worried that they're what they say. And so we are genuinely not thinking aloud as a result. And you have to be able to think aloud.
Yeah.
Here in Britain, there's particularly around the question of race and racism and sexism, the police have had BBC reporters film them in the pub, secretly film them in the pub, goading them on to, and obviously in the pub after 8 pints, you're not your best self, shall we say. And that is now entirely legitimate to record them. And they have, some people have gone to prison because of what they've said on a WhatsApp message. And I think people are scared. I think people are scared. And it does mean it's that muscle of being able to speak freely and think freely that is not being exercised. And it really genuinely, I think, is having a limiting effect. And it does mean we're not thinking deeply as a result.
Yeah. Tiffany, I need to bring this to a close. It's been so enjoyable. And we have barely scratched the surface, because this is, not quite to bed quite yet, but I'm going to have a little late dinner. But it isn't a long book, but it's both a detailed book, detailed in individual illustrative examples and cases, and also you cover an enormous amount of ground. Before we end, is there anything you wish I'd asked you that I didn't ask you, or that you wanted to say that you haven't had an opportunity to say?
I suppose the only other thing is that, because this is about public and private, this is much about the public sphere as it is about the importance of the private, and really just keeping a distinction between the two. So I think in some strange way, we only valorize the private now, but it has to be in public. Everything private has to be in public. And so what we need to do isn't just it is to limit the private and set up borders, but also revalue the public and start being better public people. So the key thing isn't to determine, to say which is better than the other, but to have both and a border between public and private.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Tiffany.
you. Thank you very much.